Good afternoon. This is Theresa Secord. I'm a Penobscot basket maker and an artist. I'm also a consultant to First Peoples Fund, and it's my pleasure today to share a webinar with you entitled Establishing a Native Art Market, Best Practices. This webinar is intended to help guide community organizers in planning and carrying out a local native art market in your community. Ideally, in most cases, the organizers will represent tribal planning offices, CDFIs or community development financial institutions, tribal museums, or other funded and supported organizations such as nonprofit arts partners. There's also material here that informs Native artists what their roles can be in helping organize and prepare for a community art market. So I'm assuming that a number of you listening to this webinar today are Native artists, and I'm hoping they're organizers as well. So why start an art market in your community? The most obvious reason is for sales, increased sales and income. Native artists living in rural areas need access to outside sales. This is a nationwide issue, particularly in rural areas. Visibility for the arts and artists is really important, and Native artists can be seen and expressed, especially traditional art forms. Markets provide open access for the community to see their own art forms and arts being practiced. I know from my own work with the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance in Maine over 25 years, networking and mentoring was a huge part of these community arts markets that we have held in Maine. A lot of times our apprentices would find mentors in these art markets where they would, visit and see the elders demonstrating, the mentor elders demonstrating their art form. And so these are not just, community market selling events, but also events for artists to gather and come together. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Community pride, where artists can be honored, particularly culture bearers, elders, but also contemporary artists. And another big thing that happens at community art markets, of course, if you're a Native artist, you know that you purchase and trade supplies. Beads, for example, in my area of Maine, for the Penobscot Nation, even the raw materials of ash and sweetgrass are traded and shared among the artists in the Indian market. Demonstrations and performance skills are practiced in markets because typically you're hiring artist demonstrators, and performances always enhance a Native art market. So these are all really good skills for artists to practice. And, a lot of times you'll have a new young drum group, for example, that'll come and support the Native artists at the art market, and they'll be hired for the first time, for example. So a lot of compelling sharing going on. So selling art is a business, and business skills are developed in practice, particularly marketing. So interfacing with customers for the first time can be really important for Native artists. And the tribal tourism and economy is enhanced. If you're bringing visitors to the tribal community for an art market, added visitors will, visit tribal businesses as well. It's really important to do the research before you set out to start a Native art market in your community. It's a little more complicated than just, throwing out the tables and chairs and setting up some awnings. You want to find out if you have enough artist support for a market in your area. You need to conduct, ideally, a community artist survey to see who the artists are, how many will participate, what the art forms are. It's a good idea to research and connect with other art markets in the area or even in the state or region that you're located in to find out how successful those other markets are. What time of year are they being held? How many visitors and how many artists are actually in attendance? And can your potential market complement these markets? You don't want to hold back-to-back art markets with another tribe that's, an hour or so away. You'll be competing, and it's too hard on the artist to try to, be working in both. And you'll be competing for the visitors because people, won't typically travel to art markets on two consequent weekends. A big question is the art market financially feasible? You really always underestimate the cost of equipment that's needed, but also in an art market, staff and volunteer time, and particularly staff time in the beginning, will be underestimated. So it's important to know if you can actually afford to hold an art market. The critical mass of artists is important, and it really helps to have a couple of experienced Indian market artists who can help other artists, get set up and can advise the organizers. You may consider, if you sending out a small couple of artists, a small group of artists to visit some of the other art markets in advance so they can bring back that knowledge. As well as you, the organizer, on what kinds of things are going to need to be considered for holding an art market in your area. Where will the customers come from? Who is the target audience is a big question to be answered. Art markets have to be well attended by customers and buyers in general if your goal is sales and income, because if they're not, you're not going to have a successful Indian art market. It certainly won't be annual. Another question to consider is, will the show be juried or not? Prize money can be expensive, and typically that's what artists are looking for too, is, the prize money, and that can be a big draw. So we'll delve into that a little bit later on. The Northwest Native Development Fund is a CDFI, a community development financial institution that First Peoples Fund has been working with for several years. And we're really proud to help them fund through a special program we're working with them on, annual Plateau Native American Art Show. So this is the poster, which I think is really lovely for their art market. And again, this is in a very rural area, Grand Coulee Dam. So the Colville Confederated Tribal artists come together and sell their art annually in this show in August. So their primary goal is to bring visibility to the arts in that region. This is like a 1.2 million acre reservation with, artists scattered throughout the region, a very rural area, and to try to bring more visibility and sales for the artists. So one of the target areas, of course, is Spokane, Washington. And with that, I'll say some of the artists have even started participating in the annual Northwest Art Show, which is in Spokane, and I forget, it's in its second or third decade, perhaps. So if you've decided an art market is feasible, it is helpful to establish an artist database right away, so you know who the artists are and you can communicate with them. And see what kind of art they make. I'm sharing a live link here, which I won't go to because I've had a technical issue trying to show that, but I urge you to type that in if you're listening right now, and you can see some of the artists that participate in that Plateau Indian Art Show annually at the Grand Coulee Dam area. But it was really important for the art market organizers to start with this artist directory. I'm not saying everyone has to. If you have a good contact list of artists, you know what kind of art they make, and you have their addresses and contact information, that's also a place to start. But this is a really nice example of a small, modest directory on the web where you can see who the artists are and what they make. And I think it's really important to understand that. I want to encourage the establishment of an artist advisory committee right up front. And this would be a paid artist advisory committee, 2 or 3 artists, perhaps, who represent different genres within your community and who are going to help advise you on what kinds of things you need to consider when you're starting up a native art market. They are the experts, especially if you've got 1 or 2 artists who have previous market experience. Ask the committee to help you establish what the actual goals might be. You know, for some markets, the primary goal might be sales. For another Indian art market, they might be thinking more in another community about art celebration or performance or all of the above. And again, this is really critical, I think, to the success of making sure you have the artists who are advising you. So this should be built into the budget, a paid artist advisory committee. Establishing goals and a vision or a mission for the market is really important. Again, you'd use these advisors to help you do that. For example, the primary mission of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance early markets was for basket sales, to provide opportunities for elders and this new, younger, next generation of basket weavers that we were teaching. Basket makers have been selling baskets from the 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine for 200 continuous years. And we knew that we couldn't encourage a new generation of basket makers to continue making the art unless they were working on the marketing piece. And so that's just, you know, what works for our area, and that was a central mission. It's going to be really important, and I'll show you a couple of templates to prepare a budget and marketing plan for your market and update this continually. Compare estimate prices with actual later on, because as I said earlier, almost everything is going to cost you more than you think. I remember, I think our awnings alone, which were a very large tent that we had all of our basket makers under with tables end to end in, but I remember upwards of that, the big one costing about $2,800 annually to have come and set up with all the tents and tables and chairs, and because obviously in a summer outdoor market needs shade. So that's a really exorbitant expense, but we built it into our budgets and our grants to make sure, you know, that was going to take place and that we could afford it, that it was financially feasible. So find a venue right away. Obviously, where are you going to hold your market? Seek out sponsors. You're going to need people to help pay for this, whether you're writing grants or seeking funding within the community. Foundations, or even local businesses, you know, if they want their name on some of the advertising you're going to be doing. Set the date as early as possible. For an Indian art market, it makes sense to set the date a year in advance is ideal. And again, and if you live in an area, which I know the Colville Confederated Tribes market was in, and the same with the ones that I've had marketing experience with in Maine, and actually New York recently for the Mohawks is tourism. And so 1 year advance is really important so you can get the marketing out there. You might want to begin with a 1-day market. A lot of people think right away we need to have a 2-day market, but that can be a lot more expensive, particularly for the artists. The artists are going to have overnight lodging unless they live locally, and so it will cost a bit more. I think it's really important to consider a First Peoples Fund Native Artist Professional Development Training to help prepare the artists for the market, especially for emerging artists. We can help with marketing and pricing and all those other critical things that people need to get their art marketed. Market vision and goals should be based in the community values of the area where you're hosting the art market. So on your own community's values. These are values that First Peoples Fund puts forth and encourage us all to think about and use in our work at First Peoples Fund and in our communities. And so these are just examples of some values to keep in mind when you're planning and organizing your art market. So identifying a market vision or mission. This is a template that I put out for you to think about. It doesn't have to be anything flowery like this, but I think, really thinking about, what is your primary mission for having a market? Because again, a lot of thought. I guess what I'm trying to say here is a lot of thought. Really should be going into the planning. This slide looks a lot like the first slide, identifying market goals. The slide I showed earlier, why start an art market? Yet I put this back in here so that you can work with your artist advisory committee and again, prioritize your own goals based on this list and come up with some additional, like, again, some people might say, well, I want to honor the artists and culture bearers. That's my most important reason for having a market. Or I'd like to provide opportunities, networking opportunities in the community. And income and exposure for artists might be third. So that's why. It's important to create action plans for each of the goals that are defined within a current year for an art market. So I'll direct your attention to goal number 3, celebrate the artists and art forms within the community and with visitors. So this is based on the First Peoples Fund planning model. So those of you who've been through our trainings, these will look familiar. So what I'm showing here are actions and tasks that help support the goals that you're setting. And again, I think, with a year planning in advance, it's a really good idea to use a template like this. So action number 1, in order to help celebrate the artists and art forms, you want to have paid artist demonstrations and performances. This will enhance your market and also make sure that you have a good base of artists that are attending and participating. You could honor and recognize culture bearers publicly at the event. This is something that's very standard in art markets. You can also highlight the local ecology, traditional food. Fashion shows are really a big part of art markets. National Indian art markets now, this is a major component at the Heard Museum Indian Fair in Phoenix coming up the first weekend in March. And of course, the big Santa Fe Indian Market every August has a major fashion show component. And these are really great draws and great fun. So, but there are tiny fashion shows associated with local art markets as well. And those can be really compelling draws and a lot of fun for the artists and also income for the people now who are working in fashion and jewelry and a lot of contemporary clothing. I think this is a really exciting kind of new venue. So identifying sponsors, of course, should be done immediately in the very first year. And think about, in addition to these obvious partners and sponsors like museums and collectors and foundations, think about, some unlikely partners as well, people who ordinarily you might not think of to help give you space or advertise or volunteer or help you pay for an art market. Identifying the venue, of course, is going to be critical. I think the local usual suspects are a tribal or local museum, a tribal culture center, or the grounds outside. This is a photo of the actual longhouse at the Evergreen State College, and this is a great, they have a great annual winter market there every year where the local artists from some of the 26 tribes in Washington State come and sell their art together. I think they're around their 20th year having that annual art market. You could have a setting at a university or a school, or again, a community park, a nonprofit partner organization. Whatever the site, it should have plenty of access, should have visibility, not tucked away, in some, far away place, if possible, kind of near, major roads, access. Definitely a lot of parking, restroom facilities, handicap accessible, of course, and stage and shaded performance space. And these aren't always easy to find on rural reservation communities, as you know. So, again, think about, this well in advance, the venue. I'm really going to go into this very much, but what I want to emphasize again is the 1-year plan. Think about how you would create tasks for each of the actions defined for the current year goals. Engaging artists and community, for example, in the first month, I've advised invite artists, culture bearers, tribal leadership, and community input. By the third month, if possible, hold a Native artist professional development training to help prepare your artists. The 6th month, just be continuing to check in with your artists, reminding them to have adequate inventory made in advance, and also making sure that everyone knows they're invited. Sometimes communication can break down over the course of a year, and so you want to be continually in touch with artists, checking your attendance, the application process that you've developed, and making sure that people are, still interested in working on, getting ready for your market. The last thing you want is to have poor communication and have a half a dozen artists show up, or find out that's all the attendance you're going to have for artists, a couple of weeks before the show. And actively engaging the artists in the 9th month or they should be all along, but really pushing hard to promote the show to their contacts and at other shows. Again, if you're developing, and I'll show that in a minute, different promotional materials, any of those artists that are going out to other shows should be taking the promotional materials of the market that you're developing with them to distribute. And finally, in the 12th month, you've made sure that you've lined up some culture bearers, tribal leaders to help open your event. This is a template for an artist market planning calendar. And again, it's the same concept of just trying to encourage the artists to create tasks for each of the actions defined for the current year goals. So you're helping artists actively plan for the show. They're active partners in the process, and their input and participation will help make sure it's successful. So this will be in the resource guide, the reference guide, and there will be post-webinar materials for everyone. So some of these tips as well I'll be also sharing on just helping make sure people are staying on track. It's really important in maintaining an art market budget. So estimated cost versus actual. And this is another area too where people do underestimate, and this is where you can see where you've underestimated your costs. Another thing I've shared in here is food. It's really important. Are you going to have a reception? The night before the market or the first morning of the market, you could have a breakfast. And so the next thing you know, you're providing food, coffee. Lunches are really a good idea to provide to artists. And so these are going to, a budget will help you, see what the actual costs are going to be. And if your market is going to be feasible for the second year. I was a participant in helping to set up a market last summer, and I think we went over budget on this one, and I think already the fundraising is happening to make sure that they can meet those costs again. It was mostly in prize money, which they knew they could make up for because this one market area had a lot of sponsors who were really excited about the art. But we were making decisions on the spot, about that. So that was interesting. But you have to be really careful, like anything else. And I also put this template in again for artists. This is right out of the First Peoples Fund, Native Artist Professional Development Training. So for those of you who haven't been involved in the First Peoples Fund work before, this can be, really helpful, because helping artists, again, track expenses and understanding how important it is to determine your own success. I've been an Indian market artist myself, in the Santa Fe market and the Eiteljorg, the Heard Museum, about a dozen years now. And there are always things that pop up that cost more, even unintended consequences, a flat tire, something gets lost and needs to be replaced. I see another big one in here is just hotel. A lot of times there are taxes and things that you didn't anticipate. So it's really important to track your expenses and encourage your artists to as well. One of the things that I see a lot of art markets fall short on is advertising. So this is my opinion. The sentence at the top, this is one of the most important components of a successful market. But again, you have to bring buyers to your market. If your primary goal is income and sales for artists, you absolutely have to bring as many buyers as possible and continue to build on that. By about year 3, and generally we see markets where that's pretty firmly established, if people are doing the right advertising. If they're not, you'll see the market really start to flag. Artists can't commit, because if they didn't have any sales the year before, why would they come back again? And so having buyers coming to the markets, which is directly proportional to how much advertising you do, is really important. After a show catches on, again, we've got a 25th annual Indian market coming up in Maine in July for the basket makers. We have a regular following, but in the first few years in particular, you cannot underestimate how critical it is to advertise. So a lot of things we've done in the past are contacting local and state tourism offices, again, if you're in a tourism state, and getting dates in publications at least a year in advance. Native arts magazines can be really helpful, and there are some great ones out there now. First Americans Art, National Museum of the American Indian has a quarterly publication, and Native American Art, where you could, for free, place a calendar listing in one of their event schedules for the year. So this is really basic, but I recommend making a list of, who and where to advertise, and going after that. So seeking out free advertising, by this I mean a lot of times a magazine will say, well, you can pay for a quarter-page ad in our magazine, and that's going to cost you $1,800. That's not what I'm talking about. I think being able to work with the editors and say, how'd you like to do a story on this fantastic contemporary artist, that is a new, painter, or a traditional rug maker, that has been practicing the same type of art in their family for 4 generations. That kind of feature article I think would be really interesting, and that's basically free advertising. And then say this artist will be featured in our art market, at this date and time. And so stories about artists and the art, I think, a lot of times are being sought after, and you can really do that without a lot of effort if there's a good writer at a magazine. Advertise as widely as possible through the venue. So if you're having your art market at a local museum, just make sure they're advertising everywhere that they normally would, and use the full power of social media marketing. I probably don't have to tell the participants on this webinar how important that can be. And again, continue to advertise to all of your networks. Public radio spots are interesting. There's an art market coming up here in Maine for the second year, and it's drawing national artists in May in Bar Harbor, Maine, which is a rock island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And I think the annual temperature is about 52 degrees, the average annual temperature in May of an outdoor market. And last year, the Abbey Museum, which hosted this Indian market and did a great job, brought several thousand, I think like 4,000 or 5,000 visitors to Bar Harbor, Maine, which basically is very quiet in May and very cold, to an outdoor show. And it was an enormous success. And so this was largely through social media, but also public radio spots. I mean, beginning in December, every day on public radio, that's all you were hearing was about this Abbey Museum Indian Market in May, and you should be there. And it was really, really effective. So that's coming up, the second annual, and they had a great outdoor fashion show, and so people can see that on the website now. Use the tribe media, social media, and ask for financial support for marketing the event. These, you know, the native artists are tribal native artists, and I think a lot of times we forget, you know, to ask for that full support, especially if you're a nonprofit or a tribal museum. You know, you should be really looking for support from the tribe, because these are artists who belong to this tribe, and it supports, you know, all artists support tribal families and on. So I have to say more. It's important to, again, just emphasizing marketing the art market, and making a compelling poster can be good. This is a beautiful art piece. I don't think you can see the full painting that this was based on, but it's a Mohawk man throwing a snow snake, which is a traditional game here in the winter. It's up in the Northeast, and so using a great image is really important. The dates are included. I think they forgot to put on the year. This was the inaugural art market, so the first one. So this is feedback that the advisory committee gave afterward, that this poster also could use the physical address of the Adirondack Experience, which is actually a museum on Blue Mountain Lake in New York, and the contact information. You could have a FMI for more information. It's also a good idea to add the sponsors' logos on the bottom of a poster. Again, this is the Adirondack Experience Museum, and this was a really great, successful first market. And I think it is because they marketed early and they marketed often. Recruited artists and tribes to market. So artists from both tribes, the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and the Abenaki people in Vermont, were a part of this, although much smaller. It was mostly a lot of great Mohawk art and social media. It's also a good idea in your market to bring in name entertainers or have a book signing as a draw. So there's so many things that you can do and advertise for. These are a couple of guides in that region in the Adirondacks that I think they got the date into one of them, but these publications need the date of a market almost 1 year in advance. And so understanding the area you're in is really important. For the Adirondacks, historically, it's been a place for wealthy New Yorkers and people from Connecticut to vacation. And so they're still picking up these summer guides in the local, you know, stores and whatever centers, tourism centers they go to, and seeing this event listed as a thing to do in August is going to be really critical for the success of this year, of this market this year. So people can put it on the calendar, and that's what we did with the work in Maine as well. We just had a winter show, which was a pretty smaller gathering, but it is and largely because of the snowy roads usually in December in Maine. But this is an example of a poster that we use there. I think it's a little too wordy, but the schedule actually does share what else may be happening so visitors can plan their day. They see that there's something happening for everyone. You know, there's going to be songs. I think sometimes there's storytelling for children. I didn't see that here on this one, but when the drumming and singing is happening, and the fashion show at 1 o'clock was an enormous success with the Conti and Brown, who are First People's Fund Fellows. And that ended up being a big draw. And this was the 24th annual. So again, you see the compelling basket image, and you know, all of the information is there for more information and the sponsors. So that's helpful. This is a rack card that we've done too for a number of years. The front is on the left and the back is on the right. So you can see we actually hold 5 markets in Maine. And again, this is 25 years of establishing little markets. And you can have 1 rack card for your market. And a rack card, again, is something that would go maybe in a Chamber of Commerce, maybe in an airport. I'm flying into the Spokane airport. Again, there are, you know, and almost anywhere, Rapid City, you know, you're going into the airport and there's an area, kind of a welcome, you know, to Rapid City area. And there are rack cards sitting there. And so, you know, what to see and what to visit during your trip. And so you can time these rack cards and brochures of your Indian market and, you know, advertise out in the places like that, in airports or wherever, stores, other museums. Art market performances, we talked a little bit about the fashion show and what a draw that is beginning to be at Indian markets. And then this one features Ray Zaragoza. She's a First People's Fund Fellow on the left, and I think she was a singer at the NNDF show, the Plateau Indian Art Show in August again. So good for her career, good for the Indian market, a nice draw for people to come and celebrate culture together. Dwayne Manuel on the right is a live painter, and so it's really cool to see a painting come together during an art show, and you know, in any number of demonstrations, and of course singing and dancing. It's important to establish artist guidelines and rules for the market, and this one will be in the reference guide, the resource guide that we'll be posting. One of the things I wanted to mention here, or a couple of things, is that in the markets I've been associated with, after a few years, we really have had to come up with some rules. Talking about vendors not selling commercially mass-produced or plastic items. I'll read a list from the rules that we have for our markets in Maine, because then you'll begin to understand what we've dealt with. Rabbit's feet, no rabbit's feet, no dyed furs, no rubber drums, spears or arrows, no mini Tonka moccasins, no plastic dolls, rhodium jewelry, turquoise and silver. It's not from our area, so we even specify vendors may sell only handcrafted items made by enrolled members of a federally recognized tribe of Maine, or if you are an invited guest, items made by members of that tribe. So it'll be different in every area, but we felt this was really important for us to come up with some rules and guidelines for our native art market. I'll read a couple of others. It's not a good idea for vendors to post discount or sale signs. It's confusing to buyers, and you know, for whatever reason, we've prohibited that at our events. We also prohibit raffles and auctions by any organization other than the venue or the art market organizers. Again, we had some examples, and you have to understand this is over 20-something years of, you know, Native artists showing up, having a raffle on some regalia that they made, and then no one ever hears about, you know, anyone winning that piece. And so, you know, just just again, thinking about the things that can happen and the people that can show up. Videotaping is another one. People coming and making movies at our events. You know, so we've got a list there, and I'll share that on the reference guide. So developing rules for your own market, I think, is really important. You're also going to want to establish standards for judging if you are going to have a juried show. This picture is from the one with the bear basket. I put it in just to show, but the Santa Fe Indian Market, of course, has standards and guidelines, which is, you know, pretty substantial. And that's actually a basket made by Jeremy Frey, a Passamaquoddy basket maker here. Beautiful piece. Some of the standards, you know, again, are going to be specific to your area. Some of the guidelines we talked about for judging at the Akwesasne Mohawk and Abenaki show had to do with beadwork, for example. Is the beadwork raised or not? You know, the sizes of beads, that's all really important, and there are major professional artist beadworkers in that area, and also found that we need judges who are you know, this is something to think about. You really need judges who are highly knowledgeable in those areas. And I would have to confess, as being one of the judges in that market last year, that we were lacking in that particular area. And so there's a lot to think about with a juried show. I think I talked about prizes earlier. And, you know, that's pretty much expected now, not just ribbons, but also prize money. So this was great. This regalia that Neil Perkins made, Best of Show winner, and I believe that was a $2,000 prize. And so it's a big draw for the artists, again, but you've got to have a substantial budget. And it also makes sense to have a substantial number of artists, because if you're judging just among, you know, a half a dozen or a dozen artists in your market, then, you know, that's not very exciting, I think, and you might not bring out the best art. So there's anyway a lot to be considered. Okay, tips for art market organizers. You really want to try to nurture the first year of a market, you know, nurture the market, try to get the artists to come and invest, you know, invest their time. They're already investing a lot in making the art, and they're going to be caused, you know, expense to come. And so trying to make it as artist friendly as possible in the beginning, I think is a really good idea. Helping to find subsidized hotel and lodging for artists can really help, especially again, if you're having people come from away and you're having a two-day event. We actually provided subsidized housing for years for rural artists to come to Bar Harbor when we have the Summer Basket Makers event, because they could never afford to come, especially a lot of the lower income elders. They couldn't afford to come to the market otherwise. And so for years we helped subsidize that travel for them. I think that was really important for them to be at the show. And again, that can be an enormous expense in an Indian art market. Providing free booth space for the first year, or maybe not charging at all. Again, kind of depends on your area. I think this is kind of ingenious. The third one, the NNDF came up with, you know, for the Plateau art market, consider a pay in advance system where they had the artists pay in advance and they would reimburse the booth fees when the artist arrived to set up. So the artists were invested in coming to the market and locked in, had the booth space locked in, and the NNDF was making the commitment and the financial you know, requirement, but then the artists were able to receive their funding back. And consider stipends, of course, for artists to demonstrate, but maybe even to attend if they're going to speak or you know, share stories about their art. That can be compelling. Or free booth space if they're going to demonstrate. That happens at the Heard Museum Indian Fair and Market, where a number of artists are allowed to defray the $300, which is the lowest price booth there. instead, and demonstrate for the weekend. So that can be really nice. It's going to be important to call artists to continue. I mentioned this earlier, to invite and continue to follow up. Artists are very busy and they have a number of commitments and shows and exhibitions and demonstrations and workshops as they might be teaching. So don't assume if you send a notice out that you're having an art market and, you know, applications for artists to apply for your art market, and, you know, they say, yes, I'm coming. Don't assume 6 months later that they're still coming. You know, this requires working with artists, requires a lot of, you know, just follow up and staying in touch. Everybody's busy now, artists or not. Ask the advisory committee to help recruit artists and visitors. A lot of times people know about an artist that other people don't know about, or they might be, you know, hanging in the background a little bit shy. And so use the artists that are, you know, in the advisory committee to help bring out artists for a nice vibrant event, and visitors that they might know who'd want to come. Their own collector lists, if people are doing that. Not everybody does. As a minimum, provide tables, chairs, and awnings. It's a lot. I think the Santa Fe Indian Market is the only market I participate in that tables and chairs are not provided, or awnings. Awnings are, but tables and chairs are not. It's a big deal to drag your tables and chairs in there, as well as your art. Although I have to confess, as a basket maker, baskets don't weigh very much. So I feel for the other artists who have to drive their art in. Talked about advertise, advertise, advertise. This is an area, again, where I feel like so many shows I've seen would be successful if only they just pushed a little harder on trying to bring more visitors. And critical, really, to have artists fill out a survey during the end of the market. You want to know what worked and what didn't. You really want to know from the artists who are, you know, the key players in this. Tips for Indian market artists I'll share as well on the reference guide to accompany. And we've talked about a lot. I've talked about quite a few of them already. I also think too, we did hold a Native artist professional development training with the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation market, and I think that was a big success. A lot of people talked about how much they used the pricing information and the tips that we gave and the marketing info for preparation for the market. So I will, this will be available. Promotional materials for artists. Again, sometimes the art market advertisers can help with the organizers can help with this. I know going back to the Mohawk market that they made table and booth banners for every single vendor. The tribe actually did, which was great, and business cards as well, as I recall. So this really helps artists to prepare you know, promotional materials that they should have anyway on hand and should have for any markets that they attend. We like to use this in the First Peoples Fund, Native Artist Professional Development Training, but I also think it's instructive here because, again, it's important to help artists, you know, prepare and see what is possible, and how to, like, you know, push yourself to show your art in its best possible way. So investing in proper equipment to showcase art at the highest level. So this is Don Montelo, a ledger artist in South Dakota, and he's also a First Peoples Fund fellow and trainer, and so he is demonstrating here what his booth setup looks like in his basement. And so he's got the right, you know, wall supports for his art, his particular art. His pieces are framed professionally and hung professionally, and they're hanging his best pieces at eye level too, I noticed. Going ahead, paying attention to details. Black or plain tablecloths can be ideal. Patterns actually detract from the art, and that's in my tips guide. And I'll show you an example of some things I saw at the market I was talking about earlier, and it's just you know, good lesson. So this looks very professional and detailed. And speaking of professionally, dressed in, for success. Everything about your presentation, including how you dress, should be as professional as possible. And I even like the wooden table box that's for added interest, that really complements but doesn't detract, from Don's art. And he's a book author also, so there are some books there. He's starting to get tired. I think this is funny how he portrays this. But also note that I noticed that his biography or his artist statement is on the wall. So this is helpful too, because for marketing, a lot of times it's exhausting to stand in a market for 1 or 2 days to talk to, could be hundreds, even thousands of people asking the same questions over and over again, and you can offer that your bio is there. Leaving empty spaces is psychologically a really good idea. Some people will even add an orange or a red sold sticker to show that sales have already taken place. And this sparks a little bit of interest and sometimes buying frenzy. I don't know if that's the word, but that could be good. And note that Don shows that he takes credit cards, and this is in my tips guide. You will lose sales if you don't. PayPal is another option. And I still will encourage people buying my art to pay with a check if they wish to and if they have one. But most people are either bringing checks or credit cards. The reason I encourage a check is, knock on wood, I've never had a bad check for my art. But Square, which processes your credit card, a lot of the processors take 2.75% of your sale. And so then you have to, kind of either build that into your sale ahead of time, and the price of your art. Is that will happen. So this is an example of the tablecloths and banners that I wanted to show. And we had these same tips for artists, like using black is a good idea in a plain tablecloth. And so I think Wilma has got that down. But for me, there's this, like, in one of the other tips in the art market guide is less is more. And so she just has, on the right here, she has so much going on. She's an amazing beadwork artist. But not only even does she have the newer ribbons that she received in this market, because she's such a high level great artist, but she has older ribbons there too. And it's just, I think it's too busy. So we talk about less is more, like showing, like, like Dawn did, spread out some of your very highest pieces and maybe even keeping other pieces for day 2 or later in the day as pieces begin to sell. It's a little bit overwhelming. And then I think the featherwork banner is really nice. Again, the tribe made these for the Mohawk Abenaki show. And so I think he's got a good thing going on here, but it was really hard to see his feather fans because Hetty had black, I think, on his table, Paul Thomas, that you could have seen the fans a little easier. And I was there in person and it was the same way. So, but still, people are practicing, I think, really good booth practices. Post-market, all of these are, I guess, kind of obvious. We'll go through still. Debrief with the Artist Advisory Committee, what worked, what didn't. Review the artist surveys. And again, make sure you're always listening to the artists because they're the ones that invest in the show, and you need to keep a core group of artists who are happy and coming back each year. How can you improve upon the sale? Again, comparing estimated budget and actual expenses. How effective was the advertising? How many people came? Can you do a rough count during the market, to look at that? How were sales? Will the artists return? As I said earlier, if artists aren't having successful sales and after a few years, they will bail on you. Thanking the venue, the sponsors, the funders, the artists, vendors, performers, and demonstrators, with a follow-up letter and at the end. And I think this is really important too, sharing photos of the market widely on social media while it's happening and especially afterward, with lots of artists and visitors, as well as performances and demonstrations. This will help you draw people to the next annual event and, really help to build the energy of a market, because this is what I guess, a good word for it, this is what it's about, is like, it's an energy of people and art and culture all coming together, and you want it to be really vibrant. some links for Indian art markets. I mentioned the one in Maine first, and this is not comprehensive. This is not all of them. I will add in the reference guide, there's a great market in Hawaii that has the wearable art show annually. And I think it's in November in 2019. It's traditionally been held in May by our close friends, the Pai Foundation, and they have a great art market that goes along with this incredible art and fashion show. And so there are a lot of markets nationwide, and we just list some of the larger ones in here. And to finish up, this is the contact information for First Peoples Fund, and I do want to thank everyone very much. I will have the resource guide available soon on the website, and I really appreciate everybody's participation. I like the chat boxes. I haven't really been. I like what Ben Sherman is saying right now. The organizers might want to track contributions of volunteers and in-kind services, and I totally agree. This is great. Thanks, everyone, and I really do hope you follow up and you're successful in your organizing your own native art markets in your own communities. Thanks again.